This November marks 100 years since the Mayflower arrived at Pod before making its way to Plymouth Harbor in December. Except the place was not yet known as Plymouth. The place was Pawtuxet, and it was devoid of its residents. In the previous 3 years, an epidemic had swept along the coast. In his 2019 book, This Land is Their Land, author David Silverman describes this as a virgin soil epidemic, in which, quote, the populations at risk had no previous contact and therefore had not developed an immunological resistance. This point, above all, explains the sheer scale of the carnage. Perhaps you were already aware that the indigenous populations had suffered disease from European sailors that visited the shores prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. Although I too had learned this, it strikes me differently today in 2020 amidst our own global pandemic, doesn't it? Today, the idea of a virgin soil epidemic resonates with the lived experience of responding to a novel coronavirus. And yet today we have science and microscopes, antivirals and ventilators. In 1620, they only had the traumatic memory of unexplained death. For the Wampanoag, their world had turned upside down. Not only had thousands died, even entire towns, but also their economic and political systems had been upended. Amidst the sickness, cycles of planting, harvest, fishing, and hunting had been disrupted. Food stores were impacted. Travel and trade with neighboring tribes had halted. To the west, the Narragansetts had successfully mitigated serious outbreaks in their community. Because the Wampanoag already viewed the Narragansetts as an encroaching power upon disputed territory, the weakened Wampanoags feared further conflict with these neighbors. But their allies to the north, the Massachusetts, the tribe from which our state draws its name, had suffered even more deaths. Confronted with weakened economic, political, and social networks, the Wampanoag future was uncertain. After 3 years of deadly disease, critical questions remained. What caused this unnamed disease? Would it return? I can still remember what it felt like in March and April as we abruptly locked down, can't you? It was traumatic. Suddenly we were in our homes, afraid to go out, afraid to pick up a UPS delivery without wiping it down and or quickly washing our hands, afraid to walk into a grocery store, to touch our groceries, afraid of strangers, of friends, of family members. Those early days felt terrifying with the vast unknowing about the transmission and treatment of the disease. Imagine having no name for the disease, no scientific research, no understanding of origin, no hope in a possible vaccine. Like us, the Wampanoag sought answers. Their healers prayed and danced, seeking both understanding and a path towards stopping the disease. And the questions and the fear were still there in October 1620 when the Pilgrims arrived on their land. As Silverman puts it, the early history of the Wampanoags and Plymouth took place against this dark background of mourning, suspicion, desperation, and fear. This is a far cry from the story I heard as a child. In that story, there was no illness, there was just wilderness and a few friendly Indians who helped the Pilgrims to plant corn. But this was no virgin wilderness. Rather, historian Francis Jennings suggests, quote, that the Mayflower landed not in a virgin land, but on a widowed land. 400 years ago, in October 1620, before that European Mayflower arrived, the land we now call America was not empty, virginal, or wilderness. It was not a new world, but a place of antiquity for the inhabitants whose presence in southern New England can be traced back 12,000 years in the archaeological record. It was a land crisscrossed with paths, clearings for planting corn, and managed forest for better hunting. Even in the Pilgrims' own records, they give clear evidence to both the remaining network of indigenous communities with whom they interacted and the recent devastation. Tens of thousands of indigenous peoples lived in southern New England before the Pilgrims arrived. According to Silverman, it would take colonists in southern New England over a century before their numbers reached the collective heights of these native groups. We see the evidence of these populations and their history in our own town today. In a tour of Wayland produced by the Wayland Historical Society, they describe how the first European settlers arrived here by following, as you probably can guess, the old Connecticut path, an ancient path laid down by generations of indigenous travelers. Then, where that path turned southwest to that Musketaquid and the Cochituate Narrows, the settlers followed a less used path off to the northwest, our present Plain Road. They continued until they reached a junction called Pine Plain, where another path heads west just south of the present Clay Pit Hill Road. In other words, as we travel upon some of our roads created centuries ago, created before European arrival, created by populations of people who had lived here for millennia. In the years before the arrival of Europeans to the area that we now know as Wayland, this land was at the edge of Nipmuc territory. And Matt, if you can share that picture. Here is a map of tribal territories in southern New England. As you can see, the Nipmucs were throughout what we understand today as central Massachusetts. To the east, the Massachusetts tribe centered their life on the coast around present-day Boston. And to the south were the Wampanoags, the Narragansett, and the Pequot Mohegans. When looking at this map, it's important to remember that this is but an estimated snapshot of a time in history. Many of these tribes were related with political and cultural histories stretching back thousands of years. Thanks, Matt. You can take it down. In the book Wayland A to Z, co-authored by Evelyn Wolfson and our own Dick Hoyt, they write, "It appeared that no tribe claimed the area as its own for permanent settlement, and that the rich resources of the river valley were shared by a number of different tribes. When European settlers arrived to create the town that would become Wayland, the historical record shows land transactions between the settlers and indigenous men named Carto and Tantamoose. Wayland A to Z suggests that Tantamoose probably belonged to the Nipmuc tribe and Carto to the Massachusetts Indians. Descendants of these Indians, of these tribes, live today. Indigenous lives are not just the past, but a living present. Hearing about my sermon topic today, a friend shared with me that her genealogical record includes a European ancestor who married a Wampanoag woman in the 1650s. Apparently, intermarriage also occurred with some Mayflower settlers. Given the disease, hardship, and death among the Europeans on the Mayflower, very few women remained after the first year. And so men married women from the local tribes. In an email, my friend writes, quote, My native lineage isn't enough for me to claim I am Wampanoag, but it is enough for me to feel a connection and to realize that all my white relations would not have survived without the lineage and contribution of Native peoples, end quote. Whether or not we are biological descendants of the Wampanoag or other Indigenous persons, we are indebted to them for their land upon which we now live. When the Mayflower arrived, the Wampanoag leader, Osamekin, better known by his honorific Massasoit, he deliberated and chose to help the Pilgrims. At stake for Osamekin was the need for a political ally against the Narragansett. What he offered was a reciprocal protection, as well as the knowledge of how to plant, fish, and survive on this land, their land. Throughout his lifetime, Osamekin faced resistance among the Wampanoag for this decision. And as you likely know, upon his death, his son orchestrated a war against European settlers, which bears the son's English name, King Philip's War. The last major battle of this war to reclaim their land from the English settlers happened here along the river, about 2 miles northwest from where I stand in the meeting house. Our religious ancestors, members of First Parish, fought and died in that battle. We are part of this history. And as so many of the names of our roads remind us, we continue to live within the world the Indigenous peoples created on this land. For good reason, there is a concerted effort to rename this holiday weekend from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. Columbus did not discover a new world, nor did the Mayflower begin the history of America. The Wampanoag, the Massachusetts, the Nipmucks, and so many other tribes lived here and continue to live here. We are on their land. We may not be able to change the course of that unnamed 17th century epidemic and its devastating consequences, nor can we undo the centuries of impact by European settlers and the generations of global immigrants. But we can start by acknowledging the people whose land we reside upon. Here by the river, people from the Nipmuc, the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Pequot, and other tribes fished, hunted, planted, lived, or simply walked along through the paths. May we honor their land, and may we seek ways to support Indigenous peoples today. So may it be. Amen.